Welcome to another episode of Brewing Headlines, your chai-filled progress report on key stories impacting the South Asian community. I'm one of your co-hosts, Preeti.
And I'm your other co-host / Chaiwali, Vinamrata.
For all of our new listeners, Brewing Headlines is a podcast about dishing out the news from a South Asian, young female perspective and exploring its impact on our community. We'll bring you cold hard facts, personal narratives, and dig deeper on how we as a community can move forward together with some hope in the new year.
Previously on Brewing Headlines, we released part A of the Kashmir episode, where we dug deep with Ifat Ghazia and Dr. Athar Zia on the conflict in Kashmir, really focused on the what and the why. This episode, we're going to wrap up that story and look forward to see how the story will evolve in 2021 and what we can do to help Kashmir as a community.
That episode had a really huge impact on me. I think my biggest takeaway was that I had shared it with my mom, who in turn chatted with her sister about Kashmir, and they had a really great conversation on their perception of Kashmir that they had obtained from their history classes when they were kids. And it was just another really great way to further connect with my family that, came directly from India. And as a caveat, my mom's sister is actually a distant relative, but in India, everyone becomes your first aunt and uncle, and all your cousins become your siblings.
Yeah, I've definitely had that experience going to big Indian functions and just looking around and being like, I don't know half of these people, but I guess I'm related to them. But anyway, we're getting sidetracked. Going back to the main topic, I'm really excited and along with Preeti to really take some of the hopelessness and guilt that I had talked about at the end of the last episode and really transform that into something more productive, which is rallying around actions that we can take to help the Kashmiri region. So with that, let's jump back into our interview. As you look forward into 2021, what are your thoughts in terms of how this crisis in Kashmir is going to unfold? Especially given COVID-19 and everything else that's been going on in the world in general, and kind of what are your top concerns going forward into the new year?
We really can't say what's going to unfold and what's going to happen, but the trend has been things are only getting worse. I feel like today is better than tomorrow. That's what I have eventually gathered with what's happening around. And things with COVID, when COVID happened in the world, we were already in a lockdown, and then we entered another lockdown. So we actually have been double lockdown when the world was trying to grapple with what was happening to them. And it's not that kind of a lockdown. They had Netflix to chill. They had all kinds of groceries, and all people were fighting for toilet paper. But in Kashmir, when we were in the lockdown, the complete communication ban, and you can't leave your house to just go a kilometer away. I was doing this kind of analysis with my quantitative professor back at university, how Kashmir hardly has been in news, and suddenly in August 2019, the graph goes high like this, and by December it died again. So people don't talk about Kashmir the way they should, and how it should always be a part of our conversations when we talk about global justice, when we talk about peace, when we talk about so many other positive good things, but it never is.
So talking about my fears, I think my fears are kind of the same. The safety of Kashmiri people, especially in 2019, Genocide Watch issued a genocide alert for Kashmir. Not many people know that. The increased fear is that the settler colonialism is on steroids, and India has vetted what it has done in Kashmir on the name of democracy and development, saying that we're going to develop Kashmir, but that's not what's happening inside Kashmir at the moment. This is indigenous people being stripped of their rights to their land, to their resources, to their dignity, to their right to self-determination.
That all makes a ton of sense. And I guess the last question for both of you from my side is, what can people do to help? And I guess I'll share a personal story, which is, so I used to visit Kashmir when I used to live in India before I moved to the States, and we used to go to Kashmir probably once every couple of months because we went to go visit Vaishno Devi, which is a big Hindu pilgrimage site in Jammu and Kashmir. We used to road trip from Delhi, where my family lives, into Kashmir, and it just felt like you entered a completely different country because the military presence was just
crazy in terms of like transitioning from, Punjab or like other states that you're passing through in order to get to Kashmir when you get there. And I remember asking my parents about it, and then especially, and they were always like, yeah, like it's to keep us safe because terrorism, blah blah blah. And like even in 2019 when the revocation happened, it's like it was pretty clear, at least to me, that it's extremely undemocratic. But when I talk about it with my parents or parts of my family who are a lot more conservative, it's exactly what both of you alluded to earlier. It's like, oh, it's the terrorism argument, right? Like that's the narrative that's so ever present in India. That's like Kashmir is like where all the terrorists are born, and like if India takes control of the region, that means that's a way in which like India can be safe. Like this is about our safety as much as it's about Kashmir's right to self-determination. And so I'm curious, like, how do we change that narrative? Because I feel like I keep coming back to that question of like, that's kind of where a lot of this problem lies, because people, especially in India, I feel like people just have this narrative that isn't inclusive of the reality. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, like how do we change that?
I think you're using really nice words. I am going to be more blatant and call it basically India only demonizes Kashmiris. It's just demonizing this lot of people. For example, when we like Kashmiris go to other parts of the India, and it's not after last year, it's all these years. My cousins who have studied in different parts of the India, how they were asked questions. So all Kashmiris have guns at home. Do you have gun at home? I only see military people with guns, and it scares me. Like I feel like as Kashmiris, we are so fragile in that sense, like seeing a gun shocks me. But of course, in India, Kashmiri people have always been demonized, and they use the same narrative and send it to outside the world. Yeah, because Kashmiris are terrorists, and that's why we are trying to that's what China is telling to the rest of the world. They are re-educating the Xinjiang people, the Uyghur people, and giving them education because they don't know what's good for them. And they are re-educating them and all of that. And that's what India is trying to sell to the right of the world. But what they are doing is they are occupying us and they are demonizing us. And all these narratives saying, oh, Kashmir is paradise on earth, and Kashmiri people have pink cheeks and all of that. I see it all in such a wrong connotation, and it absolutely sends a wrong message outside. Kashmir is not just about red apples, and Kashmir is not just about beautiful mountains. Why don't we go deep down and see what we have done to those people with the red, whether they have red cheeks or they don't have the red cheeks. So there's a lot of problem, and the way one can help is basically reading. Just read and listen from authentic Kashmiri voices, because in places like Kashmir, not everything is authentic. There's a lot of propaganda as well. There are people who are trying to tell a wrong, a lie, basically. So you should know who you are listening from. You should know who your contacts are, like whether it's legitimate enough. Listen to the stories, understand, and then amplify these voices. And as an Indian, it should be your responsibility to talk about it and tell other people about it.
Well, I would just, I agree with what Ifat is saying, that when you talk about how to educate and what the rest of the young people who want to understand Kashmir, what should they do? I think reading, especially talking about Kashmiri voices, and there are many Kashmiris in the last 15 years. Kashmiris have written, they have analyzed Kashmir from every particular vantage that they could, fathom, trying to understand that Kashmir is not a terrorism problem. It's not India's internal disturbance. It's not a law and order situation. It is not just a border dispute, but it's a question involving people. And these are peoples who want their right to self-determination. I think that needs to be seen, especially by people who are young Indians who want to understand Kashmir from a different vantage than what has been already fed to them. They have to know that Kashmir is not Pakistan's proxy war. There are elements, there are Kashmiris who want to accede to Pakistan, and that is their right. That is that is how they think. That is how they feel they should be. And that's how people are. They're different. They want different things. Why is it that when India thinks about its diversity and it says diversity towards unity, but when it sees Kashmir's diversity, why is it always seen as fragmentation?
And as a Kashmiri, if you ask my personal view, I do not want to be with India. I do not want to be with Pakistan either. I want to be independent. So likewise, other Kashmiris, they'll have their own views too. But the way India has treated Kashmiris and how they have demonized them, it eventually, of course, it affects us.
The anti-India sentiment is what binds all Kashmiris together. They might want to accede to Pakistan, some might want to be be independent, but till that goal is till the military occupation goes away, that is a common goal, and that kind of brings people together. And I think that's
absolutely. I have a relative who works in Apple, and she was literally traumatized. She wasn't able to connect to anyone back home, and then she had these Indian colleagues who were celebrating and distributing sweets. Like, imagine how it can feel for a person. And we are always expected to be these people, who are very nice to outsiders, very nice to Indians and everything, but it does affect my psyche and my being. As a Muslim, first of all, I am not taught to hate anyone. And I cannot say that I hate Indian people, but I am also not comfortable around Indian people. I recently moved to Connecticut, and it took me 1.5 months. I stayed in a hotel to look for a place where I'm living right now, because most of the places that were shown to me had Indian neighbors. Now, they could have been good people. Maybe they didn't distribute the sweets and they were not among the lot who treated themselves as conquerors, but it has affected our psyche and it traumatizes us.
I think that's the question that the world has to ask. Like, what is this entity, these people, these indigenous people? And I think the time is really ripe for us to look for solidarity, because across United States, across the subcontinent, in the Asian subcontinent, and across the world, indigenous people are getting together and having this conversation about different forms of settler colonialism, even in the US. And I think that is where the most encouraging turn of this century lies. So I'm very hopeful as those conversations and as people like you come to the fore, just trying to understand. I think it's a very hopeful moment for me, even though we know that things are really bad back home at this current moment.
Well, I just want to end by saying thank you so much to both of you for your time and for just educating us and educating everyone else that we're going to release this podcast to. And I especially want to thank both of you for having this conversation with two Indian people.
Like I said, I'm not generalizing people. It's never about individual. We can always take people on their own merit as individuals, not as group of people. I can't say all Indians are like that or all Indians celebrated. I'm just saying there have been people, we still have Indian allies and we have Indian friends. There are very good Indian allies, who believe in what we do and our work and everything else. But I'm just saying the overall, it just traumatizes you so much. You're like done with it, like whatever, whether those people are good or bad, I just don't want to have to deal with it. My concluding remarks are, first of all, thank you for having us and having this conversation with us. And second, please listen to the Kashmiri voices and amplify them and share them with your friends, because this is high time that we have these conversations, even if it makes us uncomfortable. This is high time we have these conversations among us and, try to uplift the communities that need it and try to uplift each other.
Thanks for listening to that interview with our guest speakers. We're going to take a quick break from the content and transition into Chai Corner. So with that,
welcome to Chai Corner. For new listeners, Chai Corner is a segment in Brewing Headlines where we take a break from the heaviness of our episodes for us to get to know you, the listener community, and you, the listener community, to get to know us. We do this by asking you a question that is related to the theme of the episode, and we'll start off by giving our answers and then asking you to do the same. So, for this segment of Chai Corner, our question is, what is a fun story where you have had to learn about a distant relative on the spot?
So, I'll kick that off. That sister of my mother's that I had alluded to earlier on in this episode is actually, and stay with me, listeners, my grandfather's first cousin's wife's sister. Her kids are actually my uncles, and so I often tease them because they're way younger. One of them, it just started college, and then the other one just started high school, and so I'm always like, you guys are my uncles, and they hate it because they're younger than me. But that's my fun story.
That's awesome. Love that story. My story involves my brother's wedding. He got married a couple years ago in India, And Indian weddings, as many of you know, are a beast of their own. And I had met so many people that I hadn't met or interacted in a long time, but I remember this one Masi of mine in particular. She was basically like, "You don't remember me? I was there when you were born." And I just remember instantly going through my head like, why would I remember if the last time I saw you was when I was born? Like, I was literally an infant. What? But then, obviously they're older than you and you're a young Indian person, so you have to be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, like I messed up." But in my head I was just like, this doesn't make any sense, but okay, whatever.
I love that in order to pay like deference and respect, you're like, yeah, I totally remember you from, when I was 0 years old. So if you have an answer that you'd like to share to the above question, feel free to drop us a voice memo. We have a link in the episode description, and we'll share the answers in a future episode or on our Instagram at Brewing Headlines. Welcome back to our main segment. We want to take some time to reflect on what our guest speakers presented to us and also talk to how we can concretely help uplift the Kashmir community. What are your overall thoughts, V?
Yeah, there's two thoughts that come to mind. I think the first is just the importance of story. And it's something that, we've talked about in terms of like why we've started this podcast is like we really care about underrepresented voices and stories. And it's just funny because sometimes I think I need a reminder about why that message is so important, even though, I obviously care because I started this, we started this podcast together. And so I think just a reminder of how powerful stories and storytelling can be is probably one of my main pieces of reflection, especially if that is the most important thing that we can do in terms of alleviating this issue. I think the other thought going through my head is around how to talk to my parents about it, because I think when we were talking about the narrative and the narrative changes and, even the storytelling aspect of it, so much of it, I think you bring into those narratives and those stories your own preconceptions about the thing that, these narratives are going to be talking about. And I think the narrative around the Indian centric narrative around Kashmir is so powerful within India and especially within my family. And so I think one of the reflections and questions that I'm thinking about is, how do I have this conversation? Even if I can educate myself, I think it'll be more effective if I can amplify those voices, not just by sharing them with people, but actually getting them to understand and internalize those voices. So just thinking about more tactically, like, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think having that conversation was really hard to start out with. My mom was like really questioning the resources that we got to do this interview. She was like, "Oh, did you always like were they all Muslim or were they all Hindu?" Because that's like one perspective. And I had to like have that hard conversation where I'm like, it's not about that. It's really about, the relationship that India has with Kashmir. And it's not, like we could bring the most accredited people. But that's not the point, right? The point is just getting out this new narrative. And then again, she was like, "Oh, but these are only like two voices." And again, I had to be like, it's okay that it's two voices because it's actually really, really hard to get voices heard about the situation. And I went in to explain, the communication barriers and the bans that's going in and like how much stress it puts on journalists to convey these stories because of how much danger they're putting themselves and their family in. And, having those conversations, like those are like, I guess, broad themed remarks that I think our parents and other people can kind of grasp and be like, okay. And once you start to break down that barrier between, like qualified resources and then get to the crux of the story, I think that's when it really opened up to have that conversation, at least for me.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think something that I've been pushing my parents on, and I think will be very helpful in this, is that the Indian media has their own, I mean, most media does, but I think especially the Indian media has their own spin on certain issues. And I think getting your parents to understand that, like I think my parents understand that from the American perspective. They're like, oh, like CNN has a liberal bias versus Fox News has a conservative bias. But helping them to understand that on a conservative, from like an Indian perspective, and I think highlighting that in the example of Kashmir, I think is another way in which we can do that. That's really hard, because I think my parents, like I said, and my family really, I don't think necessarily has that awareness. But I think if we can get them to see that bias, and then maybe they don't fully get rid of the bias, but at least they're able to approach it with fresher eyes than they did before, then I think that's a productive way in which we can, move forward this issue in a way that I don't think we've been able to do before.
Yeah, I think it's less about getting them to be 100% like understanding and like rah, like this is a big thing, and more about like, okay, you plant the seed that like maybe the way that we've been approaching discussing this conversation topic has been maybe unfair or unjust or clouded by some of these politics that are going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. And I think the last question I will ask / pose to both of us is, we are both NRIs, like we're both Indians living abroad. And a big part of what Dr. Zia talked about was the international complicity in what was happening in Kashmir, more from like a political aspect of the ways in which India is able to defend its undemocratic actions in Kashmir. And I'm curious, what does that mean for us in terms of our role in amplifying those stories? Like, is it more meaningful for us to amplify it to international non-Indian audiences so they're aware of what's going on? Or is it more important for us to try to convert people back in India to understand the Kashmiri side of the issue?
I don't think it's a question about which one is more important. I think the impact is kind of like a two-pronged attack, I want to say, right? I think there's two different types of narratives happening, right? The narrative that India is posing to the international community and the one that India is posing to its own people. And they may be synonymous, but I think the amount that it has seeped in is different, right? I think the international community, it's a very surface level kind of understanding and grasping, kind of similar to how I would say, like if I asked anyone, like, what is it like to talk about immigration policies in the EU? Like us as Americans will have like a very surface level understanding of that. And if someone from the EU came and explained it, it would be a little bit easier for us to like understand where they're coming from and change that narrative. I think it just requires that we have a longer and deeper discussion with our fellow Indian immigrants rather than, I think, probably what will be like a shorter conversation with our international community. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think that makes sense to me. I do think it is important. It's interesting because, like, on the one hand, I want to say yes, and I still think it is important for non-Indians to understand the importance of this issue, especially since Western media doesn't really report on things that are happening in Kashmir as much. So while I think it is more relevant for Indian audiences to be bought in and aligned and like see kind of the fallacy in some of these like pro-India narratives, I also think it is important for other people to understand and recognize that this is happening, even if they aren't necessarily Indian, more from the sake of understanding we have a good understanding of, I don't know, human rights abuses in certain parts of the Middle East, right? And we think that like that's, like in Israel and Palestine, right? And because we think that that's an issue that's important enough for America to know about. And I don't think Kashmir, just because it's, between India and Pakistan or whatever, kind of doesn't necessarily fit that category, because I think it should. It to me is another issue where it's an issue of democracy, it's an issue of human rights, and America as like the country that tries to stand up for democracy. I feel like it's even more important for non-Indian Americans to, be aware of what's going on in Kashmir.
Yeah, I think this is a hard one to answer, but I think I'm also really hopeful by the diversity we have in Congress, the ability for us to now like lobby to those diverse individuals and say, hey, let's make Kashmir a talking point. Let's start the groundwork to, have us bring this forth in the international community and talk about America's stance in helping out Kashmir. Like America used to be one of those countries that like was really like wholeheartedly invested in making the world very, very democratic in the best way. I'm not talking about like in the 70s, but I think we should find that image again, America as a push for democracy. And this should be one of those areas that we really have that conversation.
Yes. And the first step towards having that conversation starts with educating ourselves. Our guest speakers have been very kind to link us to a whole bunch of different resources to learn more about the crisis in Kashmir. And we have taken the opportunity of compiling those resources together in one shared Google Doc, which you can find at bit.ly/Kashmir-BH. If that was a lot for you to process at this time, that link can also be found in the description of this episode. We would really encourage our listener community to take this action together with us, to please read these resources, please share them with your friends, and please amplify the voices of the Kashmiri people. One voice and one resource in particular that we especially encourage you to stay up to date with is Ifat Ghazia's podcast, the Kashmir Podcast. Additionally, if you took a look at these resources and you found a resource that was missing that you'd like to share with the rest of the community, or there was one resource in particular that really stood out to you, we would love if you could DM us your thoughts at Brewing Headlines or leave us a voice memo with your thoughts. Thanks for listening to another episode of Brewing Headlines Chaiwali Edition. We're so excited to continue bringing you along this journey with us as we review jazzy and thought-provoking stories with a lot of references to chai, because let's face it, chai is awesome. We release new content on the first and third Wednesday of every month. If you like this episode, subscribe to Brewing Headlines wherever you get your podcast to stay up to date on future episodes. You can also follow us on Instagram at Brewing Headlines to learn about new episodes, hear from other members of the listener community, learn more about the issues we cover on our podcast, DM us to talk one-on-one, or participate in fun Instagram story polls over future episode topics. You can also leave us a voice memo with your thoughts, either on this episode or in the Chai Corner segment, which is linked in the episode description below. Until then, stay safe. Chaiwali out.
Chaiwali out.